Welcome to Dirt with me, Mike Wharton.
And me, Angela Mansell.
Today we're delighted to have Tim Balcon, CEO of CITB, as our guest, and we'll be asking him, among other things, what happens to all the money? So, Tim Balcon, CITB, welcome.
Thank you.
Very great to have you here. Thanks for joining us. Before we get into the real nitty-gritty stuff, Tim, would you mind just talking to us about your construction history and how you came to be in the role, how you started in building and where you went?
So I'm one of those kids that left school with not an awful lot of qualifications behind me, and I started an apprenticeship at British Gas, actually, as a service engineer. And I had no idea at that time the opportunities that an apprenticeship would give me as an individual. For me, it was 16-year-old, it's just a job, isn't it? So I worked my way through there, and within a few years I'd moved to Leicestershire to join their training department. And that's really where it started, the kind of education route that I've since taken. When I was 35, I was CEO of what was the Gas Industry National Training Organisation. So having vowed never to go back into the gas industry, never to go back into the training department, you could see that that failed on the first hurdle. And we did great things within the National Training Organisation. That became Gas and Water. It then merged into a sector skill council. I've then ran professional bodies. I've been on the board of Ofqual, which I got real insight into general education as well. And then I'd retired. Family kind of things got in the way, and I'd retired. And then this job popped up, and I just thought this is a fabulous opportunity to put all that learning into construction, where I'd like to say I started, even though it was on the edge, and actually make a difference to, I suppose, kids like me when I come out of school at 16.
What was the attraction then, Tim, about CITB particularly?
I've always been aware of CITB, and when we set Skill Council, they were one of our kind of sister organisations in a sense, and they were always a big brother of the set Skill Council were. So the scale and size, and I had an affinity with construction because that's where I found myself easily recognisable within that industry. And I always felt I could do something really quite profound if given the opportunity. So when they rang up and said, "Are you interested?" I said, well, only if we can change things. And I'm not convinced that you wanted to change things. Clearly I was wrong. They appointed me, and we've set about changing things ever since.
So you're just over 3 years into the role, Tim, and what kind of changes have you made so far?
So one of the first observations that I made, we made, as a team, we sat back, because it was just after the last but one consensus, and the feedback was quite strong there that they wanted CITB to do something different. And I felt the relationship that it had with the construction industry was not right. It wasn't collegiate. It wasn't two groups working in partnership with a common purpose. It was very much seen as an administrator of levy through a grant scheme, rather than actually trying to solve a fundamental problem in the industry, which is how do you get people trained into the industry and then upskilled through that process. So I felt there was something there, and I felt actually just sit down and listening for a while, take a step back. And CITB's got a really important job, and it's a complicated job when you handle people's money because it's their levy. They want to see a return of that back, and that always creates a kind of a dynamic. But I almost felt that giving money out was the thing that CITB did. Actually, it's one of the least important things that we do. And I'll come back to that point because I dare say that may raise one or two eyebrows. The important thing is, can we solve people's skills problem, or can we support people with their skills problem? So internally we went back into ourselves, we listened carefully, and we said, what's our role in life? And the way we described that is, if we act as the training department for the construction industry, then that kind of positions us, in my mind, in a better way. So the big companies have got their own training departments. They don't need another advisor. They can do that themselves. The smaller employers, the smaller businesses, and this industry is made up vast majority of smaller employers, don't have the luxury of having a training department or a HR team that can guide them through what workforce development looks like. So the change is really around if we can position ourselves so we can act as that advisor, that support to their business, rather than somebody that takes their money and then finds a way to give it to them back, then that means more strategically we can add more value to what we are about to do as a purpose. And when you add all that together, if we can support the industry to have a skilled and competent and inclusive workforce, that's how we describe ourselves now.
Okay, and where are you with that process then? Because the description you just gave is a great description for me and Angela to understand with the businesses that we run, which are in the tens of millions of revenue. But for your micro business, say it's a couple of brothers in a van, where does that sit with them?
Well, I think it's more important for those employees because the cost of training is exponentially more expensive the smaller business you are. And it's more difficult to engage in training because your life is around surviving as a business. To take time out and then figure out, for example, how an apprenticeship works or how to get an apprentice is just a complication that actually gets in the way of them doing the building work that they're in business to do. So one of the things that we've created over the last couple of years is the new entrant support team, and it's exactly that. This is a team that knocks on people's doors and says, can we help you to recruit new people into your business? And all we want you to do is to make sure they get a good training experience and you look after them properly. We will take all the hardship away from where does the funding come from, what college do I go to, what training providers, what's the paperwork, what's bureaucracy like. All of that is aimed at removing some of the barriers to engage those small businesses in training. The second thing, by the way, is the employer networks, which have been phenomenally successful, which is actually we just take away all of that, how to apply for a grant.
What is that, Tim, the employer networks?
So the employer network, so the concept behind the employer network was really where I started from, which is if we can have a more collegiate relationship with industry, it's working with industry. And the people who knows their training needs best are the employers themselves. CITB have a really unique position, a privileged position of being able to get all that information. But actually, when you apply that to etc., etc. So the networks is a peer-to-peer network where they can come round and they can say, this is what I would like amongst their peers. So on a local basis, they can determine what their training priorities are. Once they've done that, then we will sort out the grants. So there's no application for grants. We'll just say, look, if we can aggregate a training need, we will solve that for you. Right? It takes that hardship away. So what you've got is a local peer-to-peer network where employers can determine their skilled priorities, and then we as a support organisation act and make sure that that's available and accessible to them.
Okay, so from a communication perspective then, and again from the perspective of the micro, the industry perception, I'll hand over to Ange because I know she's got a burning question around perception and communication. Ange, do you want to just jump in there?
Yeah, I think I'm going to start off with what I think is a bit of a killer question. And I think this is the perception out there. So how fair is it to say that in the current and long-standing skills crisis, that CITB, with its bulging reserves, headcount and unrepresentative board, is being run like a golf club with no idea how to increase membership?
There's about 4 or 5 things that you've asked in there.
Yeah.
So first of all, let's take the board, representative board, because that's the easy one for me to answer.
Yeah.
They are all levy payers on the board. Okay, and those that aren't levy payers, so there are a couple of college principals who act as advisors as well, who are trustees, but they don't have any voting rights on the levy, for example. So all the decisions relating to the levy are done by employers that themselves.
But we have over 50% of levy coming from SMEs and micro businesses, yet you've only got 2 specialists on the board. So whilst I think the point I'm trying to make around that kind of representation piece is, I think the majority of levy payers are underrepresented on the board.
Well, a board has to be a manageable size, and it's around 12, which is about right for a board. I think that creates a balance between decision making and representation. The board also are very responsive to national councils. So there's an England, Scotland and Wales councils. We have a levy committee, a levy strategy committee. All of those include levy payers in that decision making process. So all of the key decision making on the issues that people are interested in are filled by members who are from levy-paying organisations. Mm-hmm. Now, if you add to that the employee networks we talked about, that is a source of rich information that we get on a local level that really takes us into the, I suppose, the very grounded feedback and intelligence that we get back saying this is what we want for our organisation. And it's very different in London, for example, than it would be in Northumberland. Okay, so we have to manage that somehow. What we've done, our chairman's done, is very passionate about this, is to make sure that the voice from employees is reflected back into the board, but the board is there has fiduciary responsibility and it has to be manageable to be able to do that. Mm.
I can feel the kind of weight of listeners on our shoulders with this one, actually, because to Angela's point, Tim, construction happens by the specialists, by the roofers, by the cladders, by the glazers, the dry liners and all that kind of thing. And with only 2 specialists on the board and there's only 1 specialist on the levy committee, how does the actual genuine building voice get heard in amongst that? And I appreciate that you've got government to deal with as well. That's a given. But what we see in the day-to-day and the risk and the safety and the mental health issues, which I want to get into a little bit later, is where is our voice at national level? Where is the true voice of the specialist?
I think if you just today troll on LinkedIn at the minute, what you would see, and we've upped our game on this one, and to be fair, we need to up our game as well. What we've seen are very local networks, and it might be often driven by the sector bodies. So roofing would be an example. Very often we'll present at a scaffolding conference, a roofing conference, those specialist kind of conferences where we can get those feedback there. Our team are constantly putting local events on, and very often it's around what is levy, how to pay the levy, and how to claim your grants as such. So there's a number of local events on top of the formal governance systems that I've just described. But ultimately, we've got 2.6 million people within construction. It has to be aggregated up somehow. Now, I'm very happy to listen if you're saying that actually we don't feel that your voice is properly being recognised, but we use these sector bodies as a conduit because we felt a partnership with those is the best way of getting specialist voices back to us. And I think I hope the sector bodies will tell you that the relationship we have is materially different now than it was, say, 3 years ago. So it's always difficult because you always get that person that's really very busy that just goes out and does their work. How do they engage with CITB? And it's difficult. And if this wasn't construction, by the way, if this is another sector, and I've worked in other sectors, you get that same dynamic. How do you get a level of dialogue that works at a government policy level, but also that you get the 2 or 3 person band builder that says, actually, I feel like I can have a voice as well. So the opportunities that we've been creating, we've opened up massively in the last 2 or 3 years, and that's continuing. But I do share your view that it's important that we get that. One of the things that we said when we first come in here, our systems are a one-size-fits-all system. And actually, the feedback that I heard when I first got here was, it tends to favour the large employers because the large employers can find a way of navigating around our administration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's why we put the employer networks in place where they don't have that administration now. That's taken away from them. So all they have to do is to engage with us. And what we have, and my challenge back to you, is how do you get your peers to actually give us this information? Because very often we find it very difficult to engage with those networks. And no matter how hard we try, it's still never enough.
It's probably the classic situation that we all find ourselves in this industry. And I think the word here is trust. I think the problem with an industry training board, and I'll come on to that word training in a bit, because it's interesting, you keep using it. And, you know, we'll go off on that tangent shortly. But it's trust, because I think so many people don't trust what's gone on before. I think it is about winning people's trust back, and that's a really big job. So one of the industry bodies that we're members of, we keep repeatedly voting to come out of the levy. So, you know, it isn't all a garden of roses, and there are voices out there that don't want to see this system exist. And to me, they are some of the places you need to be focusing on. And then just as another kind of piece of feedback, even us in our business at Mansell's, we've probably not engaged with CITB in the last 10 years. I don't even know what an employer network is. And I'm sat where I'm sat at the level I'm sat at. So if I don't, there is something amiss. The intention may be there. It's, again, the what you're establishing, but the how, there still feels like there's a way to go.
So the key thing you mentioned there was trust. And it was very obvious, you know, in my first introduction, the feedback was very strong around what CITB does. And almost everything that we did was treated with a mistrust. And it didn't reflect really the passion that my team have got actually to want to solve your problems, in a sense. Now, there's no apportionment of blame attached to that comment, but what I have is a very passionate team wanting to help the industry and some of the issues that you were talking about. I could see very clearly why there wasn't trust, because there wasn't that engagement and that dialogue around some of the decisions that were made. So very often it was we're taking money away from this, and we're now going to put it into this. Now, there's a lot of logic applied to any of those decisions, because I've seen how decision-making happens in government bodies. So you can't just make easy decisions. What was missing is taking the employers with us in that decision-making process. And this is why that we set up these local networks to say, actually, we want you involved in our decision-making progress, because we want your intelligence so that we can make better decisions. I said very early when I come, the closer any business is to its customer, the more likely it is to make better decisions. That it doesn't matter whether that's CITB or anybody else.
This then leads me into, who do you see as your customer? Because it still feels like there is confusion around who is CITB's customer.
The customers are stakeholders, so customers are the levy payers. Mm-hmm. And then the stakeholders, they are a myriad of stakeholders, but the levy payers are our primary customer.
Mm-hmm. So I think on that kind of piece around listening to the customer and the trust piece, I still think there is this sense out there that CITB has lost its way with focusing on what the customer wants and needs and how we connect. So you've started to touch on some of that. But going back to my question, the other piece on this is around bulging reserves and a small town in Norfolk that relies on CITB to exist.
So if you took that small town in Norfolk away, you wouldn't have the scaffolders, you wouldn't have the plant drivers, you wouldn't have the plant technicians to be able to do that stuff, because that's where most of the training takes place there. So we trained a quarter of all scaffolders last year and the year before. Okay, and that if you are in let me think, if you are a painter and decorator, for example, why would I want a plant operative? You know, so you've always got that, well, that doesn't matter for me, but we have to look at the whole of the industry, that 2.6 million population, and we have to do that. Without that college, there's 3 colleges, by the way, not just one in Norfolk, So there's one in
Scotland,
Glasgow, and there's one in Erith, which is South London as well. So take those away, then you'd have a bigger problem than you've got now, because one of the things that we constantly hear is, I can't get training and I don't know who the quality trainer is, and even if I can get it, I've got to send my people 100 miles away to get that training done. So you take away what's perhaps one of the best construction training facilities in the country, then you've got a bigger problem. So I have no difficulty defending that the training facilities
and it's where a lot of the headcount is, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Right.
So it used to be. So prior to me coming to CITB, there was a programme called divestment, which is actually to sell off those colleges. And it was taking people out of Bircham, so there was the move from Bircham to Peterborough. There's a head office in Peterborough. That's now where head office is. A very small office, by the way. And the college has been underinvested in for a long, long time, actually. So the quality of training started to dip, and it wasn't representative of what the industry needs to solve their skills challenges. So we are investing in that college because we need to bring it back up to speed again. And the other thing about investing in that, we can then leverage the college to get better training throughout UK, throughout Great Britain. Okay, so using the example, so for example, our completion rate on apprentices is rising, and it's way above 70% now. Across the national average, it's about 54%. So the expertise that we have built now in that college, we can then offer that out to all the other FE and private training providers to raise the quality that we've got. So we're just about to launch our training provider network, which will do exactly that. So that's coming out in July. So that's I think the college is one of those areas that I would staunchly defend, because I think you take that away, you've got a real problem.
So given the focus of CITB being on the customer, who is the levy payer, who therefore are the construction companies, and we've established 50% of those are the doers, the specialists, the micro and the SMEs, then the bulk of what we see in construction is really happening in the major cities and conurbations. So if we've got a customer focus, there is some issue, isn't there, around locations, and that piece around, if I want to get a scaffolder trained, I'm sending them to Norfolk.
Yeah.
So how is that putting the customer front and central of what they need?
Well, I mean, you can put the college anywhere in the country. It's got exactly the same problem. It's got to be somewhere, and wherever it is, it's going to favour some and not the others.
But if you've got all this data from employers and you know what they need and where they are, how are you using the information that you've got? Because by default, you should really know where the demand and the need is, and how does that follow through? Because you are here to serve employers and to serve the people paying the levy. So how does that make it better?
One of the things that surprised me when I come to CITB was CITB can control all of this, and it can't. We have 3 colleges. That is the only training providers that we can actually physically have power over. Okay. And if you look at how many colleges out there, we have absolutely zero control over where the colleges are and what they deliver and what training they do. None whatsoever. And the observation when I first come here is if we're going to solve the skills problem, skills challenges, we need to have some influence over this. So one of the things that we've been working on, I kind of touched on it earlier, we are launching a training provider network. So it'll start in summer this year. Okay. So this, in a sense, is replicating what we do with the employer networks. Now, I suppose the overall point here is we need to improve the capability and capacity of training provision, because construction training across the board is not matching the demand for training. Now, we can only solve that by actually putting that training in place. We can't do that. All we can do is influence that. That's exactly what we've been doing with government, and what you've seen from government recently is a £600 million injection into construction and construction training is exactly to do what you've just said, and it's precisely because of the influence that we've made with government, putting forward the voices from customers that says we need a more capable training provision with capacity to deal with the numbers that we are talking about. Government have heard that and made that investment. What the training provider network will do is do exactly that. So you take the employer demand, here's what employers are saying that their training needs are, then to match that with local train provision, so it creates a local ecosystem. So you create a dialogue between employers and training without necessarily CITB being in the middle of that. So we can stand around the back and just oil or feed into or pump prime bits that aren't working properly. So if you take scaffolding as an example, and one of the reasons why we kept the college is because if we did sell the college, then scaffolding training would almost collapse. Okay, so we felt that the capacity wasn't in the training system. Therefore, it required an intervention, and that's why we are making that intervention in that areas. It's the same in plant as well. And these are things that's very expensive to train. So if you look at train providers are a commercial business just like anybody else. If you look at what it costs to deliver plant training, we've just bought a crane at best part of £1 million. Okay, how can you get a small train provider or a train provider to make that kind of investment with a sector that boom and bust, which is renowned for highs and lows? Okay, it's a difficult one. That's why you need a CITB to be able to cover that boom and bust, so you can smooth out that train demand. That's why it's important that we do that. Have we got the capability and capacity of train provision currently? No, but that's precisely why we're putting the train provider network in place.
But there's a dichotomy here, Tim, with what you're saying, and it comes back to the mixture of communication and what's happening. Because looking at the annual report from last year, if we look at the greatest grant spend or grant claim per company, there are 15 with material grant claims. All of those 15 are main contractors. There isn't a single specialist amongst them. And the top one is over £2 million worth of grant reclaim. You've got tier one main contractors in there. You've got Kia at 1.7. You've got Persimmon 1.6. You've got BAM, Balfour Beatty, etc. Morgan Sindall is another one, Taylor Wimpey, etc., etc. These are not the firms carrying out the work. It's the specialist that's carrying out the work. So I understand where you're coming from in terms of the training piece, which is required, but yet the outflow of the cash appears not to be going where it needs to go.
I think what you're seeing is a shift in where that grant's going now, Mike. We've seen we are spending more money on the smaller businesses than we are on the larger companies.
This year, because this is from the annual report last year.
If you look at that trend, so we put those new entry advisors in. Okay, we put the employee networks in place. They are really shifting the balance of where grant is being put, is where grant is being paid out.
This year in 25, you mean?
I think you can see that over the last 2 or 3 years, in fairness. I haven't got those numbers to hand, but I think you can start to see that shift. It's fairly obvious. I mean, it's an open secret. To apply for grant was an administrative burden. And what we heard from many employees saying, I just can't be bothered, frankly. And for a small business, it might be 1 or 2 courses a year, and it might be 30 quid here, 50 quid there. And it's actually, do you know what, I'd rather just forget about it and do it. When you've got a large company, then obviously at £1 million, then it's you employ somebody, and that's what you do. The employee network removes all of that away, because a small employer can go to that network, request their training, and it's done for them. So it doesn't go through that. We are seeing. By the way, the other thing about those employee networks, they are engaging far more businesses that's never been engaged with CITB before.
What stats have you got around that?
I need to refer to my notes if I can.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'd like to show you, I seem to have got a figure about 23% increase in the number of employees who have not been engaged with us before and now engaged. And this is why the employer networks is successful, not because they have a better way of spending the money, because it's engaging more of those employees that's not been engaged with us before. Is
that specialist though, Tim? Is it doers or is it main contractors?
I think what we're seeing now, the smaller businesses that are trades. More likely to get involved in
trades.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So it always strikes me that when we have a focus on sort of training capacity and training need and the sorry, is it the network? Or what is
the employer networks?
The employer networks. But then what's been launched in the summer? Around the
training provider network.
It always strikes me that it is the cart before the horse. And one of the things I did want to start to touch upon is who decides what gets spent where. Because what we seem to encourage is, again, another sector of industry that is the training industry, that the only reason that this network starts to appear is because it's a commercial opportunity and there's pots of cash and money sloshing around. You introduce another layer and the money's being funneled through organisations and they've got different drivers than the employers that need the training. So one of my questions is around where should the funding sit in terms of why doesn't the funding sit with the employer? Why don't I have my own training plan and training budget, even as a micro employer that goes, this is what I need to do this year, here's my pot of money for doing it, and this is how I'm going to deliver it.
Again, there's a number of questions in that, but and if you think about what we do, so we collect around about £200 million in levy. That's the kind of give or take something. The choices on how do we spend that money has to go through our levy strategy committee, which again are levy paying employers. Okay. And then it's a mix of all the intel that we get, which is what's the trend needs of the industry, where their priorities. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that I noticed when I first got here was there was a priority around brick trades and where the skill shortages are. And I'm sat there saying, if I've paid levy and I'm not in that priority list, does that mean I'm excluded? Okay, so we need to find a way of making sure that everybody gets opportunity to do that. But the danger then lies is if all we do is find a different way of giving your money back, then I would say, well, what's the point of CITB in the first place? You can put a tax regime in place to be able to do that. There is no material value in doing that unless you can start to look more strategically about solving the skills needs of the industry, which may be different, by the way, from a skills needs of an individual employer. Right? So, and I'll give you an example. So if you look at the way we've got it, or where it has been, which is you pay us the levy, we'll find a way of giving it back if you do training, right? If you apply for training, we'll give you some money back. That opportunity, by the way, is open to everybody regardless. So nobody's excluded from being able to claim money back. The question is it in the right areas? If you look at the history of CITB, there is numerous examples where we've tried the model that you've said, and whatever the decision making at the time was, that was not deemed to work. I think the reason why it wasn't deemed to work was because it favoured the bigger employers more so, because the smaller companies don't have the wherewithal to put a training plan together, or because it's not their focus. Again, no blame attached to that. It's how small businesses tended to work. So there's been a shift in house. So all through CITB's history, there's been various models of how is this best going to work. I don't think there's an optimum model. So post-COVID, the industry was very different. You know, it was a very uncertain world. What we saw was a change in the way that employers trained their workforce, and they moved away from those longer qualifications to much shorter training programs. Actually, what we saw was more people were trained, but in smaller elements of courses. So that, I suppose, that grant system, we had to look at that and say, have we got this right in those areas? The way we've got it, or we had it then, is the grant actually going to support a changing industry? For example, the notion of productivity, digitisation, net zero, all those kind of things. Will it support an industry that moves across to that? And I started this by saying I went in British Training Department. And I want to give you a little anecdote, if I can, that explains the difficulty that we've got here. When you ask the operations department what their training needs are, they will tell you the here and now needs. You know, I've got my team aren't very good at this. Can you train them on this? It's almost like a correction or a here's my urgent needs. When you talk to the CEOs and the directors, it's more strategic. It's more, I need to move this business in this direction, and I need some management and leadership skills. I need something on productivity, etc., etc. Everybody would say that productivity is an important thing. We've offered free training for productivity and nobody wants it. No. The question is then, do we use the levy and the grant to actually start to move and nudge the industry towards something that everybody's saying is really quite important? And if you do that, then you take away some of the budgets that you've got in the here and now stuff. Or do you keep on the here and now stuff and then run the risk of the industry's not moving forward? One of the greatest successes that I've heard my team talk about in terms of the use of that grant is health and safety. And often that, people will say not just CITB staff, but externally, without that grant, or that grant was fundamental in shifting the industry to a much more health and safety conscious industry than it is now. Now, that's where, if you look more strategically at what we can do with that grant opportunity, there's the opportunity to do that. What we then need, and this is the difficulty, is the dialogue with our customers that says, we have X amount of money, it's finite. Okay, you might think it's a big pot, but I'll come back to that point if I can. But it's finite. We don't have all the money that we need to train all your staff in all the things that you want to do. So we have to make some choices. Those choices are going to be difficult. We've got our levy strategy committee, our levy committee that would kind of provide that check and balances so we don't run away with our own ideas. Have we consulted with industry? Well, if we keep on training people around abrasive wheels and health and safety, which are mandatory training things, that means that we can't move towards the digitisation, the culture shift that the industry is talking about. And that's a difficulty that we've got. And by the way, that's why it's so important that we get that trust between us. So it's not seen as a CITB decision, it's seen as an industry decision that CITB is supporting.
That's to do with channels, though, Tim, just to pick up on the comms element here. There's a twofold thing here for me. It's communication and the delivery of training. Okay, so when we look at the communication side, linear TV is dying. Recent redundancies on daytime ITV announced, for example. Streaming, YouTube, TikTok, that's where content is being consumed. And I noticed there was a piece in the annual report about a reorganisation of the marketing team at CITB. Yeah. What I see to date, and it's interesting to see your outlook as a person who has come all the way from that starting point and clearly passionate about training, but it's still the case that that is not coming through to us, to the market from the organisation as a whole. So what's the marketing strategy? What channels are being employed? What new methods are the marketing people choosing to get to people like us? How is that working?
So one of the clear pieces of feedback from the last but one consensus, of course we've just completed the consensus, was our comms isn't very good. Okay, and we just have to accept that. That is the reality.
I don't think we have to accept it, do we? We have to change it.
No, so what I'm saying is we accept the point that the comms isn't very good. Okay. Sorry, that's what I'm trying to say. The restructure that we had last summer was, I felt the comms team was too big, not doing the right things. Okay, so we took so there were 9 people that we took out of that, and we split the comms team into a comms team and a customer experience team, which is half the team now is focused on customer experience and half it is that traditional comms and marketing route. We are still it's still work in progress. So have we fixed it? Not yet. But what we've seen is a rapid growth in social media activity. Now, one of the things that we're very conscious of is, my view was I felt we were very corporate in our messages. It was all perfectly articulated.
I think that's fair to say.
Mm-hmm. But yeah. I actually couldn't understand what it is that we're trying to say. And particularly if I was driving a van in the morning, I'd be saying, how is that relative to me? And I think 90% of it wouldn't have been relative at all. So we're starting to use the digital marketing channels much more. We're starting to use influencers an awful lot more. And that really is why the engagement in our social media is going through the roof, because we're using those influencers.
Who are your influencers then? Who's doing that? Where's the driving? Because if we look at skills gap, which I know we will collectively want to talk about, how is CITB going to attract and get interested that 16-year-old, 17-year-old, 18-year-old? Because that person is engaging with their phone predominantly. They're not really watching TV particularly. Where's again, going back to the report, there's a piece about inspiring and enabling diverse and skilled people into construction. That's a quote from the report. How do you use those channels to do that?
So I'll give 2 examples. So on the plant side, we've used an influencer that goes by the name Digger Girl. Okay, she was part of the family business. You know, she'd been driving tractors since she was a kid, gone into plant in construction, and she's been one of the influencers that we've used. Again, it's by the way, there's been criticisms for this as well because of those kind of individuals that we're starting to use. But nonetheless, what we have seen is a huge amount of engagement, much more than we had done that with our traditional methodologies. And the other one was on our skill build competition. There's a guy there that won it previously. He is now partly a plumber and partly influencing, and we've used him to engage. The messages coming from those people are much more influential than it would be coming from you and I. Okay, we're not that generation.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah. Well, it's the reality, isn't it? And look, social media still bemuses me. I still can't get my head around it, but I don't need to, because those influencers are the ones that actually have got that line. One of the things I'm conscious of, when I was on the tools, okay, and where did I get my CPD from? Well, I worked for a big company, and actually they were very good with training, so I'd got a kind of a luxury that a lot of people don't get. But when I was on the tools, I used to find that when I used to get home on a night time, I used to put my dinner on my laptop, dinner on my knee, and then that's the point where I can get engaged. That's the kind of messaging to do. So the marketing team, that's their target. That's where they're going for. It's understanding how people read social media and how they use social media rather than just giving out the right messages. And as I said to you, Mike, I think we made phenomenal steps forward, particularly over the last year since that restructure, but it's still work in progress.
Okay, so coming back to this point about delivery, okay, a senior member of your team came to see us recently, and that person was very wide-eyed in a positive way, I should say, about the way we were doing things. So if you walk around our office, for example, every team has a large screen behind their collective team desk. On that screen is data coming through from our ERP, our different systems, from CRM to the construction ERP that we use. Everything is there for everybody to see. So any team can ask any other team any questions about that. And the person that came said, Tim needs to see this. Not especially because of the digital element to it, but because of the atmosphere in the office, because of how fast and dynamic it is. And one of those elements that I think we've constantly banged on about is if we send people on courses on an SMSTS, for example, they're away from the business for a week, essentially. And there are other courses like that. One of the first aid courses, as you'll know, 3 days. There are others that are 5 days, etc. And there seems to be, again, this dichotomy between the day-to-day requirements of construction delivery versus the delivery of training. And I see CITB as having a disconnect there as to how can we collectively improve that so we're not losing people from the business for a week and affecting productivity and having clients on our back. Where does CITB sit with this? Because it's definitely a dichotomy of, well, you've got to be away for 5 days. We can't.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're constantly talking about in the team is how do we get training to where training is needed. So, your point about coming to Bircham, it's a long way for a lot of people. And that's not the answer. If you're resident there for 6 months, it's brilliant. It's exactly the right place. So part of the restructure that I'm trying to think, well, the timing of this late or earlier last year was we introduced our new principal of the college, but also, she's an exec director as well, which means she doesn't just run the college. Her role is to look at all education services, and that role is broadening out to look at that. Her first task was to get the college back to where it needs to be, which we've done. Okay, it's the performance metrics coming from that are absolutely brilliant. We're really pleased with that, but there's still work to do. It's not a finished job. That's only the first thing. What's happening in that college, by the way, is a technological unit as well. So it's starting to look at how we deliver training differently. Now, if I'll be really honest, I think we're behind the pace. I mean, this should have happened 10 years ago. Right? It didn't, and for whatever reasons, it didn't. It needs to happen. If you look at FE colleges and some of the private training providers, I think they have some brilliant training facilities and trainers, but the training methodology is very similar to how it was when I was trained as an apprentice, and that's going back some years now. So your point is not lost on me, Mike. I can't give you an answer now that says, right, here's what we're going to do, other than that's exactly where the team is focused to bring the training out there to you. So I might ask you to be a bit patient with us on the minute. But again, go back to train provider network, because this is all part of the strategy in a sense, is to engage that train provider network so we have a mechanism that when we have got a technological solution, then actually we've got a network then to be able to take that out at scale across Great Britain. That's the whole point, or one of the points behind that network to do. But I do think we are playing catch up, and I just accept that point.
I think, again, going back to this recent visit, is one of the comments made to me, and again, all very positive, was a very clear we, as in the senior team, not just the local engagement people, we need to visit companies more often. We need to be here. We need to see what you're doing. We need to see the challenges that you're experiencing and how best we can support that. Because one of the things that I come back to as a supporter of construction generally, be that training, delivery, mental health, etc., I look at CITB and think, well, there are something like 700,000 SMEs in the UK involved in construction in some way, yet there are only less than 10% of that are actually levy payers or actually registered. So less than that number are actual levy payers. So where's the enforcement here? Do you have teams going around with a radar detector like an old-fashioned BT van, finding out who's not paying? Where's the scraping of the market to generate the income for you guys?
There's exactly that. There's a team, a small team. There's a team in place that's looking round at those construction companies that's operating without paying levy, and it's.
Do they get fined if they're approached and said you need to be paying levy? They say no. What happens then?
There's an assessment made on their levy contribution. Okay, and if that means that we have to claim back on previous years, then we're happy to explore that as well.
But do they get fined if they don't?
There's not a fining mechanism because we don't have the legislative powers to do that. And
okay, let me just pick you up on that, because under the Industrial Training Act 1982, employees in the construction industry who are engaged wholly or mainly in construction activities are legally required to pay the CITB levy. So to take our industry forward and have a body that represents us collectively, not just the roofers and the cladders, but dry liners and plasterers, all that sort of stuff, where's the teeth? Where's your teeth to say to people, actually, we could generate another £1 billion here and solve the skills gap, within a couple of years? Do you see what I mean?
No, exactly what you mean. And the teeth comes from the legislative powers that we are granted by government legislation.
Yeah, but Tim, you just said we haven't got the power to fine people or prosecute. So if we decided to stop paying levy tomorrow as Complete Roofing Systems, what would you do?
We would take it to court. Well, there'd be a process before we got to that point, of course. We wouldn't just go down there.
Okay, so you would take us to court, but would that be a criminal court or would that be a civil court?
I'm pretty sure it would be criminal court.
Okay, so there is a power then under industrial training. Right, okay.
We've got, without naming names, there's a case that we've been pursuing over the last 10 years, which has resulted in it's gone to the High Court, and they ruled in our favour. It said that this company who believed that they shouldn't have been paying levy, we believe that they should. So we've pursued that, and we've pursued them over nearly a 10-year period to be able to do that. So it's something we take very seriously.
What's that cost, though, that whole process,
well,
versus income at the end of it?
Well, if you were a commercial business, you would probably make a decision that says, actually, it might not be worth pursuing. The reason why we pursued it was very simply around demonstrating that we are not going to let people off the hook if they are avoiding doing what everybody else has mandated to do.
Okay, so let me rephrase the question then slightly. In any given year, the enforcement team that you're talking about, how many firms do they bring in on average to be levy paying, and how much extra is that generating?
I don't have those numbers to hand, Mike.
Okay. The enforcement piece, I think, is important because of the SME side of things. And I'm not talking about knocking on someone's door, with a big load of burly guys saying, give us the money.
Yeah.
It's more about the communication piece of, this is who we are, this is how we can help you. And if your wages are under, I think it's 135,000 now for levy threshold, you don't need to pay it, but you can still benefit from training and communication anyway. That's where it's at. But at the point that they're signed up, once their wages do get over the 135, they need to start paying, right?
So we collected ballpark figure around about £14 million from those what you were describing as that debt, if you like, from people who didn't think they should be paying levy that we felt they should. Having focused on that over the last year, that's brought in some additional income, additional levy. Okay, it's always a source of frustration for those companies who are, diligently and paying their levy, when the guy down the road or the person down the road isn't. Now, actually, it's difficult to tell who is and who isn't, right? But we will act on anybody that's any information that we get. We will act on that. I can promise you that we do that, and we've certainly with the focus that we've had over the last couple of years, we've actively gone down that path of making sure that we get as many people as we can. But it's not an easy process.
Okay, so if you go on Companies House, for example, and you look at SIC codes of different businesses, and there are a number in construction, as you'll know, there's also ONS data, which is where I'm getting the 750,000 SMEs from. How does I'll use the term enforcement team, I don't like that term, but how does that team look at the extra 690-odd thousand companies? How are they saying, guys, you need to be paying levy? What's that process? What does it look like?
There's a number of ways where we get that information, but the team is scouring. It used to be Yellow Pages. The team used to scour Yellow Pages on days gone by. Now it's social media and looking at those companies. And it could even be the fact that they're behind a van and they see a name on a van. They could even just check that person is paying levy. One of the difficulties that we have is because there are lots of startup companies and lots of companies that go in any given period. And by the time you pay a levy, you're paying levy on almost 3 years in arrears. Okay, so that means that it's... Let's just say a company is innocently not knowing that they should pay levy. Okay, what will happen is we'll get notification from ourselves, and then we will give an assessment on levy that we think that they should be paying. So it's an invoice. Now that's where the legal process starts from then on. Either they can challenge that invoice and say, actually, you've got those numbers wrong, and here's what it is, which is fine. So we'll come up with an agreement, and then that's where we take from now. Or if they choose to ignore that and continue, then we will pursue that, as I mentioned previously, through the courts if need be. But there's a whole series of advisors that can go out there to explain to a company how it works, how to fill in their forms. There's been some new guidance that we've put on the website around how to fill in your forms. Our engagement team will be very good at sitting down with people. So there's lots of support mechanisms in place. But it's a constant churn. It's a constant effort to actually just monitor who's starting up in a business, who's not starting. There's no requirement, for example, when you register with Companies House, that you then have to register with CITB.
Should there be?
Yeah, that would make it an awful lot easier, wouldn't it? One of the things, if, for example, that levy is collected by HMRC, it would make this whole thing dead easy and dead fair to everybody. there's a positive and negative to that, because if it goes to MHRC, it's classed in public money. It's public money anyway, in reality. But actually, it will be, government may decide to use that levy in a way that they see fit, as they do the apprenticeship levy, for example. If it's not working in one area, they can unilaterally move it to the other. That might not be a bad thing. That might be a choice. But it's a debate that we are constantly having.
Because you share data, don't you? You, in terms of levy receipts, you do have access to HMRC data to verify returns, don't you?
Yeah.
So part of that for me, with the advent of reverse charge VAT, as we've seen come through the industry, if you've got access to that information, you know now who's being paid in our industry immediately. And from that information, you know who is and isn't registered.
We haven't got it in the way you're describing there, Angela, at all. No.
Why not?
It's well, I wish we had. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. But this is, one of the things I've learned in this job is that, how do I phrase this? That there's lots of things that we'd like to change. Let's put it this way, and we can't. We are described in a legislative framework, and we have to comply with that. We can't step outside it, otherwise we'd be sued. Mm-hmm. And actually, levy collection is. You wouldn't design a system like this from scratch, but we have to do what we have now. We have to create the best of the system that we've got now. And it's not optimum. It's far from optimum.
Because what strikes me is £200 million is not really a lot of money. And when you've got the top 15 probably claiming the best part of 10% of that, it's even less money. And so to me, it feels like we have got this challenge, probably not dissimilar to the NHS, where I think as a country on the NHS front and as a sector, as construction, we have to make some choices, because trying to be jack of all trades and master of none. So what is the remit? What is the role? Who's going to stand up and make those brave decisions? I know we have to consult with the customers, and trying to even engage with those customers clearly is a challenge. But £200 million is not a lot of money to do everything you're trying to do. It's about
10% of the training spend in construction. Mm. Okay. So this is the difficulty that we have when we're saying, and particularly on LinkedIn, which is CITB should be paying for this, and CITB have denied me funding on this, and we get that all the time. That's just the nature of the beast, in a sense. But if you're building a house and you had 10% of the budget, where would you spend your money? It's the same scenario. And going back to something I mentioned earlier, we are spending a lot of that £200 million on apprenticeship funding. And we're spending quite a significant amount on mandatory training. Now, the debate follows is, should we be spending that money, that finite amount of money, on training that employers should do anyway, and then move it to the where we can add more value strategically, or do we keep doing what we're doing, because that mandatory training allows those small businesses to get off the ground and start to pursue their competence and their training route way? It's always a difficult one. In terms of how we do that, that's the governance mechanism of the Levy Strategy Committee, the Levy Committee, the board, all those kind of employer-led committees that are all in the driving seat around that. The executive team can't unilaterally make a decision on where to spend that money. It has to go through those customer filters. But we are in a position to provide the rationale in terms of the thinking. And I, particularly over the next strategy period, the next 3-year period, I think it's an opportune time to start unpicking the custom and practice of, this is what grant pays for, this is what I expect. I do seriously think it's time to have a look at that now.
And obviously, in my initial question, we touched upon reserves. Mm-hmm. Are you going to be the brave golf club president that dips into those reserves as in the middle of a skills crisis and spends some of that?
So the changes that we've been making over the last year, and if you look at the debate, first of all, they talk about reserves as though it's cash. It's not. Reserves and cash are different things. Okay? So we are spending at the minute, and that's a good thing, by the way, far more income than we're receiving, far more expenditure than we're receiving income. Okay, so we cannot continue to grant fund at the rate we are doing now. Now that comes to a crunch in about 12 to 15 months' time. So we have to make some corrections before now. So, and this business it works in an opposite way. So a good performance is for us to spend money because we're spending it on employers. assuming, of course, that we spend it on the right things. Okay. Now the trend has changed. So since COVID, the trend has been that there's been income coming in, and actually the training spend has not matched the income coming in, which is why you've seen that rise. Okay. There's it feels uncomfortable because what you hear in the press that CITB is sat on a cash pile. Actually, the availability, the opportunities to train are just as apparent now than have been previously. It just means that actually they've not been drawn down at the rate that's done. Either people aren't training or their training needs have changed. I think it's a bit of both. So we have to adapt and change the grant system so it reflects more of what the industry is looking for now. That's what we've been doing. So last year we spent £20 million over and above what we planned to do. And one of the real successes was last year was management and leadership training, because the appetite for that has just gone through the roof. But what I'm saying now is we can't continue to fund at the level we're doing now, because it runs out and it does dip into reserves below a level that would make us comfortable.